David Reynolds walked into the Reynolds Auto showroom. In this place, he had dedicated his life to building and expanding the business. But today, he wasn't the powerful boss behind the office door, nor the one making crucial decisions about strategy or market expansion. Today, David Reynolds was just an ordinary man, dressed in simple clothes, a black baseball cap, and an old t-shirt. With confident yet unassuming steps, he walked through the front door, the familiar smell of engine oil and new leather filling the air. This was where it all began, where he laid the first brick to build his empire. But deep inside, a question lingered: did he still remember the most important things? Could he still sense the small, meaningful moments that once inspired him to start this journey? "Good afternoon. Can I help you with anything?" A youthful voice interrupted his train of thought. David turned around and saw a young man with a bright smile and eyes full of enthusiasm. "Well, I'm looking for a truck," David replied, his voice low, with a hint of something more profound. "Something reliable, something that will last. You'll like this one." The young man, Jake, smiled and pointed to a navy blue truck, its metallic sheen gleaming under the showroom lights. "This model is incredibly durable, with superior power, and you won't have to worry about it. It's definitely a solid choice." David nodded, observing the truck. It did look impressive. But what caught his attention even more was Jake's attitude. There was no hint of pressure or sales tactics in his voice, just genuine sincerity and a desire to help. That feeling of lightness and comfort reminded David of the early days when he and his colleagues had been just as straightforward and dedicated to their customers. Jake led him through the displays, confidently presenting each vehicle without a hint of awkwardness. Every story about the cars he shared carried a sense of truth, care, and passion. "This is a tough one, perfect for heavy-duty work. Rain or shine, high temperatures, it can handle it all," Jake explained, his eyes lighting up when talking about his product. As David followed Jake through the various displays, he could feel the friendly atmosphere radiating throughout the showroom. The staff were not just busy with customers but also sharing laughs, creating a space that felt like a close-knit community. One young employee was preparing coffee in the corner while another chatted with a regular customer about after-sales services. David looked around, feeling a sense of pride swelling in his chest. This wasn't just an ordinary car dealership. It was a second home for the people working here, a place where they didn't just sell cars but also shared life stories, simple moments that held deep meaning. But in that moment, a quiet sadness touched his heart. He looked at himself and realized something he had long ignored. He had drifted away from the core values that made Reynolds Auto what it was in the beginning. As the company grew, he, too, had become more distant from those simple, meaningful relationships. It was then that a soft voice came from behind him. "Excuse me, could I bother you for a moment?" David turned around to see a middle-aged man, his eyes tired but filled with resilience. He stood there, holding a small envelope, with a young boy, undoubtedly his son, by his side. David looked into the man's eyes and felt something more profound than just a business transaction. He was slightly surprised, but a part of him understood that this was the moment that would change everything. The story of this man would take David on a journey he couldn't have anticipated. And it would forever change the way he viewed his business and what truly mattered. "So, what's going on?" David asked, his voice gentle, but his heart beginning to sense something unsettling. David felt the warmth in the showroom, even though the temperature outside had reached 85 degrees Fahrenheit. The soft light from the overhead bulbs reflected off the gleaming cars, creating a space that wasn't too luxurious but incredibly inviting. The smells of engine oil, fresh leather, and a hint of coffee from the corner cafe blended in the air. That feeling, combined with the gentle hum of conversations, made him nostalgic for the early days when Reynolds Auto had been just a small shop. Jake, the young salesman, led David through the displays, talking about each car with confidence and passion. He didn't just explain the features of the cars, he brought an energy that made everything come alive. This one, a 2021 Ford F-150, just passed 15,000 miles. It's tough enough for work yet comfortable enough for the family. You know, after work, everyone needs something to relax in. David nodded, smiling at Jake's enthusiasm. However, what he found most striking was how the employees interacted with one another. A few were chatting and laughing with old customers, while others were discussing the latest models. The whole showroom felt like a big family, with no distance between salespeople and customers. Everyone greeted each other with a genuine smile. At times, when David saw the hopeful eyes of the customers, he couldn't help but wonder if he still felt the same things that had made Reynolds Auto a place where everyone felt like they were coming home. Could he still connect with these people the way he once had in the beginning? Or had he become too far removed from the genuine human connections he had built? While David was lost in thought, a soft noise brought him back to reality. Jake had just said goodbye to a customer and turned back to lead David to another display. "Take a look at this," Jake said, pointing to a Chevy Silverado, which seemed to be the favorite of those who worked heavy jobs. "This one's perfect for anyone who needs power but also wants comfort on those long drives." David nodded and walked closer to the truck, feeling the smooth silver paint reflecting the light from the windows. Just as Jake prepared to open the door for him, a man walked into David's line of sight. He was middle-aged, dressed simply, with calloused hands that suggested he had just come back from a construction site. The image made David think of his younger self when he had started with nothing but passion and a desire to change his life. "Excuse me, could I bother you for a moment?" the man asked, his gaze slightly hesitant but filled with determination. David turned, his eyes slightly surprised as he noticed the man was with his son. "Yes, how can I help you?" David said, trying to keep the warmth in his voice. "We heard you were looking for trucks," the man said, his eyes shifting to his son standing beside him. The boy stood still, his face full of worry but also a touch of pride. "My name's Tom. This is Dylan, my son. He just got accepted to college, but my truck broke down. I'm a construction worker, and my income isn't great. I was hoping to buy your old truck if you're planning to sell it." David could feel that this story wasn't the first time he had heard it, but it still tugged at his heart. People like Tom, those who couldn't afford the new truck they dreamed of, were a familiar but haunting image. "I understand," David said gently, "but I'm not sure if my truck would be the right fit for you." Tom looked down at the ground, slightly embarrassed. "I know I can't afford a new one, and I don't have much hope of buying through a dealership. But if you could sell me your truck, I'd be willing to pay what I can." David looked at Dylan's eyes, full of hope but tinged with anxiety about the future. Tom had done everything he could to get his son into college, but everything seemed to be slipping away, like the old truck they needed to replace. At that moment, an unusual feeling stirred inside David. He wasn't just seeing a man and his son. He saw himself. And in that instant, David knew what he had to do. Sometimes, doing the right thing was more important than making money. "All right, let me think about it," David said, his voice softening. "Jake, can you show them the used F-150? It only has 15,000 miles on it, and the price will be more reasonable." Jake glanced over, not entirely understanding the change in David's tone, but nodded and led Tom and Dylan outside to the lot. David turned to look at the man, feeling that something much bigger was beginning to unfold. David stepped out of the showroom, a strange feeling rising within him that he couldn't explain. Under the twilight, the outside air remained sweltering, with temperatures reaching nearly 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun was still casting its final rays of the day, painting everything with a warm golden hue. But David's heart didn't feel warm. It was instead enveloped by a strange sensation, heavy yet full of hope. He saw Tom and Dylan, who had just stepped out of the showroom, standing next to the used F-150. A car that David felt something special about. Tom and Dylan stood a short distance away, staring at the truck as if they were looking at a gift life had given them after all the tough years. David knew this wasn't just a simple vehicle but an opportunity, a door opening to a different future for this family. Tom, a middle-aged man with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands, his face marked by years of hard labor on construction sites, stood there with a worried yet resilient expression. He looked at the F-150, his eyes reflecting something profound. A light that David knew wasn't material desire but rather an unspoken dream. Tom wasn't admiring the truck for its beauty or luxury but because it was a vehicle that could help him take his son to school. Something that would help him achieve a dream he had never dared to voice. Dylan, Tom's son, stood beside him, hand resting on the truck's hood, looking at the vehicle with eyes full of wonder. The 18-year-old, though young, had the eyes of someone older, as if he had seen all the hardships his father had endured. Under the sunlight, Dylan's eyes sparkled like tiny stars, reflecting the hope he held in his heart. But David also noticed something in those eyes that made his heart tighten, a hope that perhaps was too distant for a family like theirs. Suddenly, Tom spoke up, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was hoarse, and it was as if every word was a struggle from deep within his soul. "We heard you were looking for a truck," Tom said, glancing at David before looking down at the ground. "I think your truck might be a good choice for me. But I don't know if I can afford it." A strange feeling crept through David's chest. It was as though he was standing in a pivotal moment, where the decisions made weren't just about buying and selling a car but about how people treated each other in times of difficulty. Tom wasn't pleading, wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. All he wanted was a safe vehicle to take his son to school so he wouldn't have to worry about the coming days of struggle. "What do you do for a living?" David asked, his tone softening, no longer carrying the coldness he usually had during business transactions. Tom raised his calloused hands, staring at them as if they were marks of an endless battle. "I'm a construction worker. I work under the sun, close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit every day. When it's cold, I have to face bone-chilling winds. I work 10 or 12 hours a day, but my wages aren't enough to support my family. I've tried my best to save, but it's still not enough to replace my broken-down truck." David quietly listened, but inside, a strange feeling rose. It was empathy, but not the usual kind. It was a deep understanding, as if he, too, had once stood in Tom's shoes and had once wondered if he could ever overcome everything. But he had. And now, he couldn't stand by and watch this man, with all his humility and resilience, drown in worries with no way out. "My son, he just got accepted into college," Tom continued, his voice faltering. David could see his eyes redden, tears welling up but held back. "He's going to a university about 100 miles away. But my old truck, I don't know how I'll get him there. He's worked so hard, never giving up. But I can't take him if I don't have a truck. He can't take the bus. I just want to do everything I can to help my son." David's eyes flickered with an undeniable light. He looked into Dylan's eyes, where the light of hope had begun to fade. Not because he didn't believe in himself, but because he realized that everything had its limits. And today, that limit was the truck. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was the only link between Dylan and his college dreams. David sighed deeply as though releasing a burden that had weighed on him for far too long. A part of him, a part he had buried for years, suddenly surged to the surface. That feeling was like a cool breeze blowing through his heart, awakening him. "All right," David said, his voice gentle but resolute. "I'll help you." Tom turned around, his eyes wide, stunned, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. "You'll help me? You're not one of those people who only care about money, are you?" David smiled softly and shook his head. "No, I'm not like that. I know I can help you, and I will. Let me help your son get to college without worrying about the truck anymore." Tom stood still, his eyes filled with tears, and then the tears began to fall. They weren't tears of weakness but of gratitude, an overwhelming sense of appreciation. For the first time in his hard life, he felt a spark of hope ignite within him. Dylan stood nearby, his eyes lighting up as he heard these words. He couldn't believe his luck. It felt as though he had been given an opportunity he had never dared to dream of. David stood there, looking at the father and son. They didn't need to say another word because their eyes had already said everything. This was why he had started this job. Not to make money but to create life-changing moments for people like Tom and Dylan. At that moment, David understood that life wasn't about numbers or profit. It was about people. It was about helping each other in the most difficult times. The atmosphere at Reynolds Auto seemed to settle after David's words. The entire parking lot became silent, as if time itself had come to a halt. Tom and Dylan stood there, still in disbelief at what they had just heard. Tom's tears continued to fall. Not out of failure but from shock and profound gratitude. These tears, heavy like stones, were filled with hope as if they carried a new strength for those who needed it most. David looked into the eyes of Tom and Dylan, and his heart tightened. A warm feeling spread within him, like the last rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds, illuminating the entire dark sky. He understood that this action, though not grand, could change a whole life. It was not just about selling a car. It was about offering an opportunity to a family so they could continue to rise above life's challenges. "Jake!" David called out to his sales assistant. His voice tinged with tension but also full of resolve. Jake immediately turned around, his eyes curious, but upon seeing David's look, he knew that something important was happening. "Give them the F-150, the used one, with all the financial paperwork completed. They won't have to pay a single dime," David said, keeping his gaze fixed on Tom and Dylan. Jake stood there for a moment, perhaps surprised by his boss's sudden decision. But without saying another word, he nodded and quickly walked towards the F-150. David didn't look at Jake. But in his heart, he knew this decision was the right one. Good things often don't need explanations. Action speaks for itself. Tom, still standing silently, tried to stop the endless flow of tears and eventually regained some composure. You don't have to do this." His voice faltered with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you. Truly. I didn't think I deserved this." David shook his head, his voice calm and sincere. "No, Tom. It's not a favor. I'm just doing the right thing. And I'm glad I could help." Tom looked into David's eyes. And in that moment, all his confusion and awkwardness melted away. He realized that this wasn't an act of charity but an act of compassion. Life's difficulties and challenges aren't the end. They are opportunities for good-hearted people to help one another overcome them. And David, the stranger who he had never met, was now the one offering his family a chance to change their fate. "Dylan, come here, son," Tom called gently, and Dylan walked over. The young man stood beside his father, looking up at the man in front of him with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Thank you, sir." "We don't know what to say." David smiled, his eyes warm. "No need to thank me, Dylan. You're the ones who deserve this chance." He turned to look at Jake, who had just returned from the car, his face showing evident emotion. "Jake, take care of the paperwork for them. Make sure they don't have to pay a penny. Help them with all the paperwork, and we'll take care of the rest." Jake said nothing, only nodded, but in his eyes shone respect. This was the first time he had witnessed such an act of kindness. He understood that, in this world, people like David are rare. He wanted to remember this moment so that later on, when he looked back, he could be proud to say he worked for a boss who didn't just know how to make money but also learned how to change lives. Tom and Dylan stood there, looking at the F-150, their eyes now filled with something different. No longer anxious or uncertain but instead full of joy, hope, and trust in the future. Tom reached out and shook David's hand, saying nothing more, but the handshake, long and firm, conveyed everything he couldn't put into words. Dylan looked at his father, then at the truck. And a mix of excitement and joy filled his heart. He knew that not everyone gets an opportunity like this. Opportunities like these don't come to those who only dream but to those who never give up and are willing to work hard for their families. And now, he felt that his dream, though just beginning, was slowly becoming a reality. David stood there, watching the Tom family, feeling a strange sense of peace. He didn't need anything else but to see the smile on their faces. This was the reason he started Reynolds Auto, not to make a profit but to bring about real change for lives that truly needed it. Small actions, yet meaningful, can change destinies. When Dylan got into the F-150, sat in the driver's seat, and Tom sat in the passenger seat, David felt a weight lift off his shoulders. This was what he had been searching for. Not the numbers on a ledger, not the expansion strategies, but the life-changing moments, no matter how small, could bring about a profound difference. As the Tom family drove out of the parking lot, David stood there, watching the truck until it disappeared from sight. The feeling in his heart was beyond words. He knew that life wasn't just about work, it was about people. And today, he had done the right thing. As the F-150 finally disappeared from view, David Reynolds stood silently, his gaze fixed on the empty space where the truck had once been. The sun had set, leaving behind a brilliant orange sky, with the light gradually fading. But David's heart remained undisturbed. A strange sense of peace flooded over him as if he were living a new life, free from the constraints of fame and wealth. This was what he had always dreamed of, not financial success, not figures or profits, but the moments that truly brought meaning to life. Helping others, changing their destinies through simple acts filled with humanity. These were the things that created real value. David stood in the vast parking lot of Reynolds Auto, a place he had dedicated his life to building, feeling the cool breeze as it swept through and savoring the serene atmosphere. Suddenly, he felt something unusual. As if he were living in a new existence, detached from the chains of glory and money. He was no longer the head of an empire, no longer a boss making strategic decisions, but just a man doing what he should have done a long time ago. Jake, the sales associate at Reynolds Auto, stood nearby, saying nothing, but his eyes spoke volumes. He understood. He had witnessed a part of David's journey without needing any further explanation. What had just happened for the afternoon was enough for Jake to realize that David's actions today were not just those of a boss but those of a man rediscovering himself, fulfilling the great mission of his life, to change the lives of those around him. David turned to Jake, his gaze full of gratitude. "Jake, I want to share something with you." His voice was deep, no longer the stern tone Jake was accustomed to hearing. "I'm the founder of Reynolds Auto. I'm David Reynolds. You might not know this, but I started from nothing. And you're working with the very person who started everything you see here." Jake paused, his steps slowing. At that moment, he looks at David as if he is seeing a different person. Someone he had never thought about before. He was stunned, unable to speak immediately. You're David Reynolds?" David smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a boss trying to ease the tension. It was the smile of a man who had discovered something important about life. "Yes, Jake. I'm David Reynolds, but today, I'm not your boss. I'm just a man trying to do the right thing. I'm someone trying to find myself again, and nothing matters more than helping people like Tom and Dylan." Jake stood silent for a moment, as if absorbing everything that had just been said. Indeed, David Reynolds was a great businessman, the founder and operator of a successful car dealership. But today, what he saw was not a boss concerned with numbers. What he witnessed was a man. A person looking into the eyes of his customers not as transactions but as life stories, unfulfilled dreams. "You know, Jake," David continued, his gaze growing deeper, "when I started Reynolds Auto, I thought I would change my life through cars, through making money. But I was wrong. Cars are just tools. They help people move. But the most important thing is helping people move forward in their lives." Jake now fully understood. He was no longer just a sales associate, no longer just an employee at a car dealership. He was a part of a journey of a man rediscovering his ideals in life. He smiled a respectful smile. I can't put into words what I feel, but I want to thank you for showing me a completely different way of living. A way of life that not everyone understands, but one that can change the world. David didn't respond immediately. He looked out the window, where the light was gradually fading. A gentle breeze swept through, bringing a sense of warmth. He felt something inside, an unspoken connection. Something he had never thought about while looking at the figures on financial reports. What he sought was not material success but the positive change he could bring into other people's lives. After a long pause, when the stillness returned, David turned back to look Jake in the eye, and then he stepped out of the showroom, where the cars were still waiting for customers. But for David, everything was different today. The vehicles were no longer just items for sale, they were opportunities to help people like Tom and Dylan, who were dreaming of a better future. As the showroom door opened, David stepped outside, feeling a profound sense of peace filled his heart. He stood under the night sky, sensing the calm and power of moments of change. And he knew that this was what Reynolds Auto truly needed. Not just a car dealership but a company that changed lives. David stood there, looking up at the vast sky, reminding himself. Life isn't just about numbers. Life is about people, about kindness, about what we can do for others. And that's why I started all of this. With those thoughts, David knew that his journey had only just begun. And Reynolds Auto was not just a car dealership, it was a symbol of change, love, and kindness in every decision, in every action.